Paul Fugate was a veteran park ranger at Arizona's Chiricahua National Monument. On Sunday, January 13th, 1980, the 41-year-old Fugate was on duty at the monument's visitor center when he stepped outside to hike a nearby trail. He told a colleague he was going to do a trail and left wearing his National Park Service uniform, including his ranger badge and a green jacket, expecting to be back soon. However, Paul never returned from this routine patrol. By nightfall, concern began to grow extremely rapidly. A seasonal park employee staying at Paul's residence became alarmed when he did not come home after dark and alerted the park superintendent. That evening, the superintendent and two others searched nearby trails with flashlights, calling out Paul's name in the cold canyon air, but found no trace of him. The following morning, a full-scale search was launched. On January 14th, 1980, the Cochise County Sheriff's Office organized a search and rescue operation, soon joined by National Park Service personnel and other agencies. Over the next 2 weeks, an intensive search effort scoured Chiricahua's rugged terrain. Teams of rangers and volunteers, eventually numbering over 20 people and a search dog, combed the trails and canyons, assisted by a National Guard helicopter overhead. Would-be rescuers rappelled into steep rocky crevices and fanned out in a line to inspect every ravine and gully within at least a half-mile radius of the visitor center. Despite these exhaustive efforts, not a single piece of evidence was found. One set of footprints initially raised hope until searchers realized the prints belonged to one of their own team members. Aside from that, the search turned up nothing. No clothing, no equipment, and no sign of Paul Fugate. After roughly 2 weeks, the official ground search was scaled back, with Paul still missing. In the months and years following his disappearance, volunteer search parties occasionally combed the backcountry beyond the initial grid, checking remote trails and even old mine shafts. Tips and purported sightings of the missing ranger trickled in from around the country, but none led to a breakthrough. In one instance, a man spotted in New Mexico turned out to be a different individual, and a report of someone resembling Paul in the Florida Keys also proved false. Despite the Fugate family's persistence, no physical evidence of Paul Fugate has ever been recovered. To this day, he remains the only National Park Service ranger to vanish without a trace and never be found. From the outset, law enforcement suspected that Fugate's disappearance involved foul play. After the fruitless initial search, authorities began treating the case as a possible crime rather than a lost hiker incident. A formal missing person investigation was opened in 1980 and has technically remained open ever since. Early on, a notable lead emerged. About 5 days after Paul went missing, a park volunteer named Richard Horton recalled a disturbing sight from the day of January 13th. Horton and his wife had been driving in the area when they passed a pickup truck speeding away from the scene. Personally, I find it weird that this memory took 5 days to resurface, but hey, that's just me, and maybe I'm too skeptical. In the brief glimpse, Horton believed he may have seen Paul Fugate slumped between two men in the truck's cab traveling at high speed. Investigators found this account compelling enough that at the end of January 1980, they arranged for Horton to undergo hypnosis to dredge up details of the memory. Under hypnosis, Horton described the vehicle as a dark green pickup with a camper shell. He stated that the driver was a bearded man in his 30s, wearing a plaid shirt, and a second man in the truck was wearing a green jacket resembling the Park Service coat Fugate had. Horton recalled that Paul looked sad and dejected, as if he were semi-conscious or being held against his will. There were even reports from other park staff around that time of skid marks on a dirt road near the faraway ranch area and potential signs of a scuffle in the dirt. This lent some credence to the abduction theory, but despite these leads, no suspects were identified. If Paul had indeed been kidnapped or slain on January 13th, The perpetrators had a head start before investigators honed in on that scenario. Law enforcement pursued various tips and theories in the ensuing months, but progress was elusive. In July 1983, the Cochise County Sheriff's Office publicly stated that new information had led them to conclude Paul had been slain. They made an official announcement that the arrest of more than one person was imminent. This clearly raised hopes that the mystery was on the verge of being solved. However, no arrests were ever made in connection with the case, and the leads underlying that 1983 announcement apparently ultimately went cold. Given that the investigation is still open, the true nature of this announcement and why it never led to an arrest remains unknown. However, before this 1983 announcement, there was a slight hiccup in the case. Since he was missing in the line of duty, Paul's wife, Dodie Fugate, continued to be paid his salary, a source of apparent contention in the Park Service. In early 1981, Howard Chapman, the Park Service's Western Regional Director, reviewed the case and made a harsh determination. He declared that Paul Fugate had likely voluntarily abandoned his position. This bureaucratic ruling treated the disappearance not as an on-duty tragedy, but as an apparent desertion. The Park Service formally fired Paul retroactively for being absent without leave, halted the salary payments to his wife, and even demanded that she return the wages paid. And to add insult to injury, the Park Service wanted significant interest payments on everything that had been previously paid out. This seems to be an incredibly harsh and bizarre stance to have taken given the circumstances of the case. But as you'll see in a couple minutes, Paul may not have been liked by the higher-ups. After an outcry, the service agreed not to force an immediate repayment, but instead planned to recoup that sum from Fugate's federal retirement account. Dodie Fugate was informed she had no right to appeal this decision, because in a Kafkaesque twist, any appeal needed to be filed personally by the employee himself within 20 days. This was an impossible condition given that Paul was of course missing. Dodie fought back, seeking support from officials and lawmakers. The case caught the attention of Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater's office, and his office applied pressure on the Park Service to reconsider its stance. In 1986, 6 years after Paul's disappearance, the Park Service finally revisited the case in depth. After examining every report, witness statement, and search record, the 1986 review team concluded there was no evidence that Paul Fugate had staged his own disappearance. Further, they found no evidence that he was still somewhere out there, alive and living his best life. In the absence of definitive answers, several theories have emerged about what happened to Paul Fugate. Investigators and those who knew Fugate agree on one point: foul play is the most likely explanation. Both the evidence and the broader context suggest that Paul probably encountered dangerous individuals on his hike and met with violence. The Chiricahua National Monument is not only remote and mountainous, but also lies in Cochise County, about 80 miles north of the Mexican border. In 1980, the region was beginning to see increased activity from substance traffickers using routes through the Chiricahua Corridor. This is an area historically used by smugglers moving all manner of illicit cargo northward. Paul had gone hiking in the Faraway Ranch section of the monument, which was, and remains, a relatively secluded area. In fact, Faraway Ranch and the surrounding terrain would later gain notoriety as a haven for smuggling. Decades after Fugate's disappearance, in 2014, a park employee was violently assaulted at Faraway by cartel affiliates, underscoring the real dangers present in that area. Given this context, a prevalent theory is that Paul accidentally stumbled upon smugglers or other criminals on January 13, 1980, after which he was permanently silenced. Another theory, considered early on but largely discredited by the evidence, is that Paul Fugate intentionally disappeared of his own free will. In the initial stages of the investigation, some officials posited that Fugate might have become disillusioned with his job or personal life and chosen to walk away forever. This idea was partly fueled by Fugate's personality and history. He was known as a bit of a nonconformist within the Park Service, famously one of the first rangers to defy the agency's strict grooming standards. Years before, he had even been briefly fired in 1970 for not cutting his hair, only winning back his position after a legal battle that lasted until 1976. Because of this maverick streak, some wondered in 1980 if Paul had grown tired of the Park Service's rules or of other aspects of his life. There was talk of marital strain and even speculation that Paul might have secretly followed an allegedly pregnant girlfriend to another city. However, no credible evidence ever supported the notion that Fugate disappeared deliberately. In fact, tangible evidence strongly contradicts it. When authorities searched Fugate's home, they found that he had left behind virtually everything important to him. He left his wallet, around $300 in cash, an extensive and valuable weapon collection, high-end camera equipment, and even an antique truck he was in the process of restoring. Nothing was missing except Paul himself, a fact that implies he had fully expected to return. While it's impossible to completely rule out that Fugate could have vanished by choice, the consensus today is that this theory is highly implausible given the circumstances. Others have speculated that he may have fallen into a crevice or an abandoned mine shaft or fallen victim to some sort of other natural hazard. Some have even suggested he could have been felled by an attack from a wild animal. All these theories, though, are completely unproven, and given the extensive searches for him, it seems likely some trace of him would have been found. At present, the most likely theory remains that he came upon some bad men from south of the border. And this is the theory I personally think is most likely. While it isn't evidence, of course, I've read numerous accounts online about the inherent dangers in this area due to it being a corridor for international crime. I suspect that someone with a bit of a maverick streak like Paul may have been more likely to intervene on his own in a situation where he ought to have called for backup. Or perhaps he saw a situation where he simply had to intervene, given that someone was facing the imminent and immediate threat of harm. Also, just as a quick aside, the Park Service treating him like a common criminal and coming after his likely widow really rubs me the wrong way. After all, this is a guy who very well could have given his life up heroically in the line of duty. On June 2, 2015, a routine rafting expedition through the Grand Canyon turned into a baffling mystery. Morgan Heimer, a 22-year-old river guide from Cody, Wyoming, was leading a commercial rafting trip along the Colorado River. Heimer was an experienced outdoorsman, a strong swimmer, and a seasoned guide familiar with the canyon's perils. That afternoon, day 6 of an 8-day trip, the group stopped near a landmark called Pumpkin Springs at River Mile 213 for a side hike and some cliff jumping fun. As clients took turns leaping from a low rock ledge into the water, Heimer assisted them, ensuring everyone's safety. Once the last client had jumped, Heimer mentioned to the lead guide that he was going to take a short break while they prepared to head back to the boats. The lead guide stepped away briefly to speak with a guest, but when he turned around, Morgan was nowhere to be seen. At first, no one panicked, and it was assumed that Heimer had simply wandered off for a moment of solitude or to relax out of the sun. He was last observed at approximately 4 p.m., standing on that riverside ledge with his guide gear on, including a life vest. He was also carrying a distinctive purple water bottle, which the park officials hoped would be a significant clue going forward. There was no splash, no cry for help, no obvious sign of an accident. One moment he was part of the group, and the next he had vanished almost into thin air. Hours passed with the team assuming their guide would reappear after his break. It wasn't until around 7 p.m., when Morgan failed to show up at camp for dinner, that serious concern set in. The other party members searched the immediate area, calling out his name and scanning the river's edge, but there was no trace of Morgan. As dusk fell with still no sign of the young guide, the group realized something was very wrong and placed a satellite phone call to park authorities to report him missing. Early the next morning, Grand Canyon National Park rangers launched a major search and rescue operation. A helicopter crew flew to the area at first light on June 3rd, inserting rangers near the spot where Morgan was last seen. 3 ground teams fanned out along the rocky banks, while a boat team scoured the river. Searchers faced grueling conditions and the summer heat was extremely intense. Despite these challenges, they combed diligently through an extensive area, covering roughly a 14-mile stretch of river and about 4 miles of adjacent land around Pumpkin Springs. They looked for any clue: a piece of clothing, footprints, his purple water bottle, or the dark life vest that might have been caught on rocks or river debris. When initial sweeps found nothing, the search radius was expanded westward downriver toward the Diamond Creek takeout. This is a popular exit point for rafting trips about 12 miles beyond where Morgan disappeared. The idea was to ensure that if he had been carried downstream, no stretch of riverbank would be left uninspected. Interviews were conducted with everyone on the trip, and even with other river groups who had been in the area, in case someone had seen something that might help explain what happened. But day after day, the canyon yielded no secrets. There were no signs of a struggle or an animal encounter, and no evidence that Heimer had attempted to hike out of the canyon on foot. By June 8th, after 6 full days of intensive searching by air, water, and land, not a single clue to Morgan's fate had turned up. With heavy hearts, officials made the difficult decision to scale back the operation. The search was transitioned to a limited mode, meaning rangers and pilots would keep an eye out for any telltale signs during routine patrols, but the large-scale hunt was suspended. Morgan Heimer's disappearance left both investigators and loved ones grasping for answers. Here was a capable guide, intimately familiar with the dangers of the river, equipped with a life jacket and survival knowledge. Yet he had vanished without leaving even a footprint behind. In the immediate aftermath, the working theory was that Morgan must have somehow fallen into the Colorado River and drowned, his body likely swept away by the strong current. This theory made sense to many. The river was swift and powerful, and even with a personal flotation device, an accident in certain rapids or whirlpools could pin a person underwater. If he was caught in an underwater crevice or entangled in debris, his remains might not surface for a long time, if ever. Rescuers noted that given Morgan's skills and fitness, they initially believed he would be easy to find, which made the complete lack of results even more troubling. As days passed with no sign of him, the presumption of a fatal water accident grew stronger, simply because no other scenario had any supporting evidence. In the absence of answers, several theories persist among those who follow the case. The prevailing theory remains that Morgan fell into the Colorado River and succumbed to a tragic accident. Perhaps he lost his footing on the wet rock, or got too close to the edge, and the river's swift current did the rest. If so, the Colorado may have carried him far downstream, or pinned him in a submerged pocket, explaining why extensive searches failed to recover a body or even a piece of gear. Another theory, harder to reconcile with Morgan's expertise, is that he ventured briefly into the wild and got fatally lost or injured. Did he step inland for just a moment, to find a private spot or to take in the view, and then suffer a fall in the labyrinth of cliffs and crevices set back from the water's edge? The area is remote and unforgiving. Even a short walk away from the group could turn treacherous if one slips into a hidden ravine or encounters an unseen hazard. Yet, considering Morgan's familiarity with wilderness terrain, this makes this more unlikely. After all, he was acutely aware of such dangers, much more so than the average person. Moreover, the intensive land search found no trace of him in the surrounding quarter-mile radius of the canyon, where such an accident would likely occur. This theory, while not completely impossible, leaves many park officials skeptical, given the lack of any supporting evidence. Other more sinister activities have also been suggested, from foul play to potential supernatural explanations. However, neither of these theories have any evidence to back them up, and they remain highly speculative. Today, nearly a decade later, the disappearance of Morgan Heimer remains an open case and an enduring heartbreak for his family, friends, and the tight-knit river guide community. The National Park Service keeps Morgan on their list of cold cases, and the investigation remains officially ongoing in a limited capacity. On a crisp March morning in 2012, a white Ford Escape sat abandoned at the Newfound Gap overlook in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, a silent witness to an unfolding mystery. Its owner, 24-year-old Derek Lucking, had vanished into the wilderness before dawn. Derek was by all accounts a responsible young man and a recent college graduate, but that day he was nowhere to be found. Inside his vehicle lay one eerie clue, a handwritten note that read, "Don't come find me." Derek lived in Louisville, Tennessee, not far from the Smokies. In the weeks leading up to his disappearance, he had been unhappy with the direction of his life. Family members noticed he wasn't acting like himself, he grew withdrawn, and even picked up some uncharacteristic habits like drinking and smoking. These were small red flags, but nothing to suggest what was about to happen. On Wednesday, March 14th, 2012, Derek left home unexpectedly, sometime during the night. The next morning, he failed to show up for work. His roommate found Derek's alarm clock ringing in an empty room and knew something was wrong. Calls to Derek's phone went unanswered. Alarmed, the roommate contacted Derek's parents in Virginia, and they began a frantic overnight drive to Tennessee to search for their son. When Derek's parents arrived and checked his computer for clues, they discovered he'd been researching Great Smoky Mountains National Park. More tellingly, he had reserved a hotel room for the night of March 16th in Cherokee, North Carolina, just outside the park. Clinging to hope, his parents headed toward Cherokee, thinking they might intercept him there. Early on Saturday, March 17th, surveillance cameras at a motel in Cherokee captured Derek in the lobby around 4 a.m. He checked out and walked into the pre-dawn darkness, carrying a small day pack. This was the last confirmed sighting of him. When his parents reached the hotel later that morning, they learned they had just missed Derek. Inside the room he left, they found a Bible on the bed and an empty liquor bottle on the floor, objects that hinted at a personal crisis during his final night. Shortly afterward, as Derek's family drove back through the park, they spotted his Ford Escape parked at Newfound Gap, a scenic pass on the Tennessee-North Carolina state line. The car was empty, and fearing the worst but determined to find him, they alerted park rangers immediately. Investigators opened the vehicle and discovered an assortment of newly purchased camping gear and supplies inside. Derek had clearly been preparing for an outdoor excursion. There was a tent, a sleeping bag, tools, maps, food rations, and a survival guide. Strangely, all that equipment was left behind in the car. Derek hadn't taken the tent, the sleeping bag, or most of the supplies with him, only what he could fit in his pack. His wallet, identification cards, and cash were also in the vehicle. And on the dashboard was that ominous note, "Don't come find me." It now seemed that Derek had walked into the woods of his own accord, for reasons unknown. Park rangers and search teams sprang into action as soon as Derek was reported missing. The park was busy with visitors that day, yet no one remembered seeing a hiker matching Derek's description. On that clear spring morning, he had slipped away unseen. Searchers initially combed the popular trails from Newfound Gap, calling his name and looking for any sign of him. When that yielded nothing, they pushed into the rugged woods off the trails. For days, teams of rangers, volunteers, and search dogs scoured steep ridges and creek valleys near where the car was found. They looked for footprints, scraps of clothing, or any other clue, but found none. Derek had only a light day pack with him and was not an experienced outdoorsman, which made his situation even more precarious. After about a week of intense searching, not a single trace of him turned up. As the days passed with no results, the official search was eventually scaled back. Derek had effectively vanished without a single trace. In the absence of answers, a few theories have been put forward to explain what might have happened to Derek Lucking. One theory is that Derek intended to vanish on his own and start a new life. The note he left strongly suggests he did not want to be found. Perhaps he was overwhelmed by his life and saw escape as the answer. It's possible he staged his hike into the Smokies as a diversion, then quietly slipped away from the area. Abandoning his car and ID, he effectively shed his old identity. While no evidence has surfaced that he resettled somewhere else, he could have managed to stay off the grid. Another theory is that Derek was in a disturbed state of mind and went into the wilderness intending not to return. He had been struggling emotionally, and the timing of his disappearance reportedly coincided with the anniversary of his grandfather's death. The Bible and empty liquor bottle in his hotel room suggest he might have been wrestling with despair or seeking courage before venturing out. In this view, the note in his car reads like a final goodbye to his friends and family. However, since no remains were found despite extensive searching, this heartbreaking scenario is unconfirmed, and his family holds out hope that it isn't what happened. A third theory is that Derek ventured into the mountains on a personal survival challenge but fell victim to a mishap. And surprisingly, there is some circumstantial evidence to support this. He was reportedly a big fan of Bear Grylls, who was very well known at the time for his show Man vs. Wild. Perhaps he wanted to test himself by going off trail with only basic supplies, though that doesn't explain the supplies that were left behind. Unfortunately, the Smoky Mountain wilderness is unforgiving, especially for someone alone and inexperienced. It's easy to get lost, injured, or succumb to exposure in the steep, tangled terrain. If Derek was hurt or stranded far from the trails, the vast expanse of the park could have kept him hidden from rescuers. In this scenario, his disappearance was a tragic accident. He underestimated the wilderness, and nature simply hid all traces of what happened. A final theory is that Derek encountered danger in the form of another person. Some have speculated he could have stumbled upon an illicit activity, or met someone with bad intentions in the woods. Of course, this is entirely possible, but ultimately no evidence supports this idea. There were no signs of a struggle or theft at his car, and all his valuables were left untouched. No witness reports or leads have ever pointed to any crime whatsoever. Without any concrete clues suggesting foul play, investigators consider this the least likely explanation, though it can't be completely ruled out. More than a decade has passed since Derek Lucking walked into the Smoky Mountains and vanished, and no trace of him has ever been found. His family has never stopped seeking answers, and the case remains open. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to take a moment to share this video with your friends and on your socials. Also, if you didn't know, I also have two other channels, Lazy Chill History and Lazy Chill True Crime. These channels revolve around historical content and resolve true crime cases respectively. In June 2016, Floyd Roberts III, a 52-year-old high school teacher and former NASA engineer from Florida, would go missing under mysterious circumstances. An avid outdoorsman, he joined two friends for a backcountry hike in a remote part of the Grand Canyon. Roberts had decades of hiking experience and was well prepared with food, water, and maps for the planned 9-day journey. The group's route would take them across the rugged Shivwitz Plateau and down to the Colorado River, eventually exiting the canyon on June 26th. For Roberts and his friends, this trek was meant to be a grand adventure, and they had done a similar trip in 2010. But on the very first day of the 2016 trip, Roberts mysteriously disappeared, sparking an intense search and a baffling mystery that remains unsolved. On day one of the hike, June 17, 2016, the trio encountered a hill near an area called Kelly Tank. They decided to take two different routes around it and meet up shortly after. His companions climbed over the hill while Floyd walked around its base. When his friends reached the other side, Roberts was nowhere to be seen. They waited and called his name, then retraced their steps back to where they last saw him, but found no sign of their friend. By the next morning, they realized something was very wrong. They hiked until they could get a cell phone signal and called for help. Roberts was officially reported missing to park authorities on June 18th, nearly 24 hours after he had last been seen. The National Park Service launched a large search and rescue operation immediately. The location in the western Grand Canyon was extremely remote and rugged, making access difficult. Park rangers, volunteer wilderness searchers, and search and rescue teams from two counties converged to help. A base camp was established near Roberts' last known location to coordinate the effort. Over the next 6 days, dozens of people scoured roughly 10 square miles of canyon and plateau country on foot and by helicopter. They faced harsh conditions. An extreme heat wave had temperatures well over 100 degrees, and the terrain was dense with brush, cliffs, and steep ravines. Despite these challenges, searchers combed the area day and night, determined to find any sign of Roberts. Helicopters flew low over ravines looking for the bright red of his shirt or the blue of his backpack, and search dogs were brought in to track his scent. Some potential clues did surface, and at one point, a set of shoe prints was spotted in the dirt, but rangers could not confirm if it belonged to Roberts. No other trace of him or his equipment turned up during the extensive sweep. By June 23rd, after an exhaustive effort, officials had to scale back the search. With no leads left to pursue, the operation shifted to a limited search, where rangers would keep an eye out during routine patrols. In the absence of evidence, several theories have been proposed about what might have happened to Floyd Roberts. The main ideas include an accidental fall, disorientation leading to exposure, possible foul play, and even a voluntary disappearance. One possibility is that Roberts suffered a misstep and fell into a hidden canyon or off a ledge. The area is full of sheer drops and tricky terrain. If he fell and was injured or killed, his body could be concealed in a spot that search teams never checked, which would explain why nothing was found. There have been numerous cases in the Grand Canyon where a missing hiker's remains were discovered only years later in a hard-to-reach area. Another theory is that he became lost and succumbed to the elements. Facing extreme heat and lack of water, Roberts, despite being an experienced hiker, may have become extremely disoriented and confused. Roberts might have wandered in the wrong direction seeking a route or water source and eventually collapsed from dehydration or heat stroke. If he moved beyond the search zone before he died, his remains could still lie undiscovered in the vast maze of side canyons. Alternatively, he may have sought refuge somewhere hidden and perished there. Investigators considered foul play, but found no evidence to support it. The authorities considered it unlikely he encountered a hostile stranger in such an isolated area. Further, his hiking companions, who were reported to be a father and daughter who were his longtime friends, alerted authorities as soon as possible. They also cooperated fully with the investigation and were almost immediately ruled out as suspects. Park officials found no signs of a struggle or any other indication of criminal activity at the scene. The absence of any evidence makes foul play a remote possibility, and most observers lean away from this theory. Another theory suggests that a wild animal such as a cougar could have attacked him and taken him away from the area. However, mountain lion attacks are extremely rare, and there was no sign of any encounter between one of these big cats and Floyd. Some have speculated that Roberts chose to deliberately vanish. This would mean using the trip as an opportunity to leave his life behind and start anew. However, those who knew him saw no indications of this. He had a stable job and family ties and was excited about the hike. Further, no motive or any proof of planning ever surfaced. Thus, this theory is generally considered the least likely by the authorities. Nearly 9 years have passed since Floyd Roberts went missing, and the National Park Service still lists his case as an open investigation. Glenn and Bessie Hyde were an adventurous young couple whose honeymoon adventure in the Grand Canyon became the stuff of legends. Their journey was meant to put their names in the record books, but instead, it became a mystery with more twists and turns than the Colorado River itself. Glenn was born in Idaho in 1898 and grew up working on his family's farm. An experienced outdoorsman, he had previously built his own boats and navigated wild rivers, and in 1926 he ran the Salmon and Snake Rivers in Idaho. Bessie, born in West Virginia in 1905, had an artistic bohemian streak. She was a poet and had even tried her hand at theater and art. The two met as passengers on a ship traveling to Los Angeles in 1927 and felt an instant connection. At the time, Bessie was unhappily married to another man, but she obtained a quick divorce the following year. Just one day after her divorce was finalized, Bessie married Glenn on April 10th, 1928. For their honeymoon, Glenn proposed an ambitious journey. He would build a custom boat, and together, they would run the rapids of the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. If successful, Bessie would become the first woman ever documented to navigate the Grand Canyon in this way. But this intrepid duo wasn't planning on breaking just one barrier. They were planning on setting the record for the fastest navigation of the Grand Canyon by boat. Beyond the thrill of exploration, the couple saw this journey as a path to fame and fortune. They planned to write a book about their adventure and go on a lecture tour recounting their exploits. In the late 1920s, such daring exploits captured the public's imagination. Charles Lindbergh had recently flown across the Atlantic, and adventurers were celebrated as heroes. Glenn and Bessie hoped their river voyage would catapult them into that pantheon of explorers, and at ages 29 and 22 respectively, the newlyweds eagerly set out to make their mark. On October 20th, 1928, 6 months after their wedding, Glenn and Bessie launched their honeymoon adventure. In the town of Green River, Utah, Glenn had constructed a sturdy 20-foot wooden flat-bottom boat suitable for heavy rapids. Local rivermen remarked that the homemade craft looked ominously like a coffin, and warned that few amateurs attempted the Colorado's rapids in such boats. Undeterred, the Hydes pushed off down the Green River, which feeds into the Colorado, aiming to reach Needles, California by early December. Only about 50 people had ever navigated the entire Grand Canyon by boat at that time, underscoring the audacity of their attempt. The first weeks of the voyage went relatively smoothly, especially given the difficulty of the voyage and the fact that Bessie was inexperienced in rapid river conditions. Glenn's river running experience and careful preparation paid off as they traversed Utah's Labyrinth and Cataract Canyons and entered Arizona. But the Colorado River in Grand Canyon was more formidable than anything Glenn had seen. In letters to his family, he described the rapids as longer and fiercer than those he'd encountered elsewhere. The journey was not without scares. At one point, Glenn was tossed out of the boat, and Bessie had to pull him back in, and another rapid nearly swept Bessie overboard. Still, by mid-November, the couple had traveled over 200 miles and reached Bright Angel Creek in Grand Canyon, achieving a remarkably fast run for the era. That said, they no longer had any meaningful chance of breaking any speedrunning records, which changed their plans slightly. On November 15, 1928, with the most dangerous stretch of river still ahead, Glenn and Bessie decided to pause their river trek. They hiked up the Bright Angel Trail to Grand Canyon Village on the south rim to resupply and rest. During this brief layover, the Hydes drew attention. They were interviewed by a reporter from the Denver Post, and their bold trip was noted by tourists and locals at the canyon rim. The famed Grand Canyon photographer Emery Kolb welcomed them into his studio at the rim. Kolb had twice run the river himself and knew its perils well. He took a now famous photograph of the couple standing at the canyon's edge on November 17, 1928. Observing them, Kolb noted that Bessie appeared worn out and apprehensive about continuing the journey. He also observed that Glenn was extremely exhausted, but determined, perhaps to the detriment of the couple. Emery Kolb urged the newlyweds to postpone the rest of the trip until spring, and even offered them additional safety gear, such as life jackets and inner tubes. Glenn refused all assistance, insisting he and Bessie were strong swimmers and determined to finish the trip without such help. According to Kolb, Glenn declared, quote, "I'm going to do it without life jackets or else," a defiant statement that in hindsight sounds foreboding. It appears that they didn't take these basic safety precautions under the belief that it would make their story more sensationalistic after they had completed the trip. On November 16th, they met a wealthy adventurer, Gilbert Sutro, at Phantom Ranch and agreed to give him a short ride downriver. Sutro rode with Glenn and Bessie for a couple of days, and on November 18th, 1928, they dropped him off at a location called Hermit Camp. Gilbert Sutro would be the last person to ever see Glenn and Bessie, and the Hydes continued downstream into the canyon's isolation. Glenn and Bessie never arrived at their destination. They had expected to finish their voyage and meet family in Needles, California by early December. When the scheduled date passed with no word from the Hydes, concern rapidly grew. Alarmed by the overdue newlyweds, Glenn's father, a man named Rollin Hyde, launched a vigorous search effort almost immediately. In December 1928, Rollin traveled to Grand Canyon and organized multiple search parties. Experienced river runners, including Emery Kolb, the photographer from earlier, and his brother Ellsworth, joined the effort. Rollin also enlisted experienced Native American trackers to scour the canyon rims for any sign of the couple. Such was the concern that the U.S. Secretary of War was convinced to authorize an aerial search of the Grand Canyon, a dramatic measure in those days. On December 19, 1928, an Army aircraft scouting the canyon finally spotted something: the Hydes boat, adrift in the icy Colorado River. It was floating upright in a calm stretch of water near River Mile 237, not far from the end of the Grand Canyon at the Lower Granite Gorge. A few days later, on December 24th, Emery Kolb reached the abandoned boat and inspected it. Mysteriously, the vessel was in good shape. It hadn't been smashed up as one may expect in a fatal rapids accident. The boat was upright and undamaged, merely holding about a foot of water inside. Even more puzzling, all of the couple's supplies were still neatly stowed. Glenn and Bessie's personal belongings remained strapped in place. Their food provisions, cooking gear, and blankets. Even their coats and hiking boots were still in the boat. Amongst the other significant items found aboard were Bessie's diary and the camera containing photographs of their trip. Nothing appeared amiss, except for the fact that Glenn and Bessie were nowhere to be found. Searchers combed the area for clues. They discovered footprints and a campsite believed to be the Hydes' last camp, around River Mile 225 or 226 near Diamond Creek. The diary recovered from the boat provided a tantalizing glimpse into the final days of the journey. Bessie's last entry was dated November 30th, 1928, nearly 2 weeks after the Hydes were last seen by Sutro. In that entry, Bessie noted that they had successfully cleared the rapid at the 231-mile mark and were likely ahead of schedule, having regained lost time. The fact that they had regained this time may have meant the couple was taking further unnecessary risks in an effort to make the story more media-worthy. This suggested they had survived many days beyond November 18th and navigated some of the canyon's hardest rapids. By all evidence, the Hydes had been making good progress and were within about 40 miles of their goal in early December. One possible clue came from a canyon prospector who reported seeing a brown leather jacket floating in the river around the time of the Hydes' disappearance. Bessie was known to wear a brown leather jacket, raising the grim possibility that she had been tossed into the water. That said, the jacket was never recovered, and that clue ended up amounting to nothing. Despite exhaustive searches by land, air, and water, no bodies or definitive traces of Glenn or Bessie were ever found. The official investigation eventually concluded without a clear resolution. No remains meant no way to say for certain what happened. Investigators presumed the couple had met with a tragic accident in the canyon. In the absence of other evidence, authorities believed that at some point in early December, the Hydes' boat struck hidden rocks in a rapid near mile 232. It's believed that this forceful strike ejected both Glenn and Bessie into the cold, swift river. Given that neither had worn life jackets, the strong currents could have quickly swept them under. On paper, the Hydes were declared dead by drowning, but the lack of concrete proof left the case frustratingly open-ended. The disappearance of Glenn and Bessie Hyde made headlines and captivated the public in 1928 and 1929. Here was a daring young couple who ventured into the wild for their honeymoon and simply vanished. Newspapers recounted their adventurous spirits and the enigma of their empty boat. At a time when Grand Canyon expeditions were front-page news, the Hydes' fate became one of the great unsolved mysteries of the American West. The story's elements, romance, adventure, and an unexplained vanishing, would continue to spark curiosity and conjecture for decades to come. In the immediate aftermath of the failed expedition, most people accepted the simple explanation that Glenn and Bessie Hyde had suffered a fatal mishap on the river. Park authorities noted the treacherous nature of the rapids at mile 232, which had a history of wrecking boats and was considered the likeliest point of disaster. However, the very mystery that made the Hyde story famous also invited speculation. With no bodies recovered and some puzzling aspects, like the boat being undamaged, alternative theories began to circulate in the years following 1928. Even early on, those close to the case pondered different scenarios. Emery Kolb, who had been among the last to speak with the couple, theorized that perhaps disaster struck while they were scouting a rapid on foot. River runners often walk along the shore to examine dangerous rapids before running them. Kolb speculated that one of the Hydes might have slipped into the water and the other jumped in to attempt a rescue, leading both to be swept away. Glenn's father, Rollin, had a different idea. He wondered if the couple might have encountered trouble with a rapid, decided to abandon the river, and tried to hike out of the canyon on foot. In Rollin's scenario, Glenn and Bessie could have gotten lost in the wilderness and died of exhaustion and exposure in a remote area. However, search teams never found footprints or tracks leading away from the river, which some believe makes this unlikely. Rumors also took hold, and with Emery Kolb playing such a prominent role in finding the boat, some whispers cast suspicion on him. These unfounded suspicions gained little traction until many years later, when a grisly discovery on Kolb's property would revive such talk. But I'll come back to that in a moment. Others looked to the hides themselves for answers. One dark theory suggested that perhaps Glenn, described by friends as determined and occasionally stubborn, might have lost his temper and harmed Bessie during an argument. Conversely, some speculated Bessie might have grown desperate to escape the perilous journey and slain Glenn. Both of these ideas led down the rabbit hole of theories that either one of them may have escaped and lived out the rest of their life under a new identity. Decades passed, yet the story of the hides refused to fade away. In 1971, 43 years after the disappearance, a startling claim made headlines and briefly suggested a very different ending to the tale. That year, an elderly woman named Elizabeth Cutler joined a commercial rafting trip down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. As the group swapped stories around a campfire near Diamond Creek, the quiet older woman calmly announced to her fellow rafters, "I'm Bessie Hyde." She told a brutal story of how she allegedly had to slay her husband in self-defense. After capturing headlines and attention, the authorities investigated her, and she was determined to have fabricated the entire thing. She was a retired psychology professor who, and I'm not joking here, said she made the false claim as a social experiment. Yeah, you heard me correctly. Elizabeth Cutler dropped, "It's just a prank, bro," as her defense in 1971. Truly, she was decades ahead of her time. But then things got even weirder. And trust me, this won't be the last time I drop that line. Another twist came to light in 1992 with the death of legendary river guide Georgie Clark. Georgie was a pioneering woman in the Grand Canyon rafting community, famous for her own river exploits. After she passed away, friends sorting through her belongings found some curious items, including the marriage certificate of Glenn and Bessie Hyde. Further, they found a birth certificate for a woman named Bessie DeRoss. These discoveries led to rampant speculation that Georgie Clark had actually been Bessie Hyde living under a new name. The coincidence of the name Bessie, the possession of the Hyde's documents, and Georgie's secretive nature fueled this theory in the public imagination. However, historians quickly noted that Georgie Clark's early life was well documented and did not match Bessie's biography. No credible evidence ever tied Georgie to the Hyde case beyond those curious artifacts, but some people still theorize the two may have been one and the same. But then things got even weirder, yet again. Meanwhile, a more concrete discovery had been made years earlier that cast suspicion back on Emery Kolb. In 1976, Emery Kolb died at the age of 95, having lived at the Grand Canyon for decades after the hides vanished. In 1977, as Kolb's historic studio was being sorted and cleaned, workers made a gruesome find in a boathouse on the property, a skeleton stuffed inside an old wooden box. The remains appeared to be that of a young adult male. The unknown skeleton's height and build roughly matched Glenn Hyde, and chillingly, a bullet was found lodged in the skull. This discovery spurred sensational rumors that Kolb, one of the last to see the hides alive, might have slain Glenn and hidden his body for nearly 50 years. Some theorized that Emery had slain Glenn after having become infatuated with Bessie. What happened to Bessie in this version of events varied, but in the end, it wouldn't matter due to a forensic break in 2008. Finally, in 2008, Modern forensic efforts solved the riddle of the skeleton and cleared Emery Kolb's name. The skeleton was eventually linked to an individual who voluntarily departed the world in 1933. But it begged the question why a photographer and river runner was keeping human remains. A dig through the historical archives eventually produced what many view as a satisfactory answer. Emery Kolb had served a variety of official roles in the region, and around 1933 he had served as a representative of the local coroner. It's suspected that Emery collected the skeleton and then improperly stored it. Nearly a century has passed since Glenn and Bessie Hyde set off down the Colorado River, chasing adventure and a place in the record books. What was meant to be the journey of a lifetime instead became a dark, unsolved chapter in wilderness lore. It was supposed to be an enjoyable mother-daughter hike in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, but little did they know it was going to turn dark. On September 25, 2018, 53-year-old Susan Clements set out on a scenic trail with her daughter near Clingman's Dome, the highest point in the park. They anticipated a routine afternoon adventure amid the early autumn beauty of the Smokies. Instead, by nightfall, Susan had vanished into the misty mountains, sparking a massive week-long search and a baffling mystery that continues to haunt those who remember the case. Susan Clements was a mother of 3 from the Cincinnati area. She was on vacation in the Smokies with her youngest daughter, eager to share the wonders of the national park. An active, outdoors-loving person, Susan was no novice hiker. In fact, earlier that week, she and her daughter had tackled some of the park's more challenging trails, including one with steep elevation changes. On this fateful Tuesday, their plan was relatively simple. Take the Forney Ridge Trail to a scenic spot called Andrews Bald, and then return to the Clingman's Dome parking area before dusk. The hike is a few miles round trip, a pleasant day hike, not something that would normally pose a serious risk for someone like Susan. They packed light, carrying no heavy gear or overnight supplies, since they fully intended to be back by evening. That afternoon, the two set out from the trailhead in good spirits. They reached Andrews Bald and began the return leg of their hike in the late afternoon. As they neared the end of the trail, close to Clingman's Dome, Susan's 20-year-old daughter decided to go on ahead. She was a faster hiker and wanted to climb the short, steep path up to the Clingman's Dome observation tower for one more panoramic view. The plan was straightforward. They would split up briefly and meet back at the parking lot. It was around 5 p.m. when Susan's daughter hurried ahead up the path, and Susan continued at her own pace toward the parking area. Neither of them realized that this small separation would soon become a life-altering decision. When the daughter returned to the parking lot after her quick detour to the observation tower, she expected to find her mother there, or at least see her coming down the trail. But Susan was nowhere to be found. At first, the daughter wasn't alarmed. Perhaps her mom was just a few minutes behind, or had paused along the trail to catch her breath. The weather had been growing dreary. A light fog was creeping in, and daylight was starting to fade. She waited, scanning the thinning crowds of visitors for any sign of Susan. As the minutes ticked by, an uneasy feeling set in, and by around 6 p.m., with dusk approaching and still no sign of her mother, that unease turned to panic. Desperate to find Susan, her daughter decided to retrace their steps down the Forney Ridge Trail. She headed back into the woods, calling out for her mom and hurrying to the spot where they had last been together. The trail was growing dim and quiet, enveloped by foggy clouds that often shroud Clingman's Dome in the evenings. There was no trace of Susan on the path, and no answers to her daughter's shouts except the muffled sounds of the forest. Fearing that something was very wrong, Susan's daughter rushed back and alerted park authorities that her mother was missing. It was now night in the mountains, temperatures were dropping, and a light rain had begun to fall over the area. Thus began one of the most extensive search operations in Great Smoky Mountains National Park's history. Park rangers immediately organized search teams despite the challenging conditions. Klingman's Dome sits at around 6,600 feet, and that night the mountain was cloaked in darkness and dense cloud cover. Visibility was near zero in some spots. Any hope of quickly finding Susan that first night was hindered by the foggy, rainy weather and the rugged terrain. The few hikers and tourists still in the vicinity were questioned, but none had seen the missing woman. The searchers faced a long, anxious night on the mountain, and they knew the odds of locating a lost hiker in those conditions were slim until daylight. By first light on September 26th, the search effort exploded in size. The National Park Service called in resources from far and wide. Eventually, around 175 trained personnel from numerous agencies and rescue organizations across multiple states joined the mission to find Susan Clements. They set up a command post at Klingman's Dome parking area, which was closed off to the public so search crews could work unimpeded. Teams of rangers, volunteer ground searchers, canine units, and personnel with helicopters and drones spread out over the area. In the initial days, searchers hiked an estimated 500 miles of trails, repeatedly sweeping the routes around Klingman's Dome. When those yielded no sign of Susan, they turned to bushwhacking in a desperate final attempt to locate any sign of her. The terrain was unforgiving. The Smokies are notorious for dense undergrowth. Over the next several days, the park was drenched with up to 3 inches of rain, and the park became unseasonably cold, factors which hindered the bushwhacking operation. Then, on the afternoon of October 2nd, 2018, 7 days after Susan disappeared, the search came to a tragic end. In a tangle of thick vegetation by a cold, trickling creek, about 2 miles west of the parking area, the body of Susan Clements was found. She was lying on her back in the creek bed, amid the rocks and rhododendrons. The location was in extremely rugged terrain, roughly 3/4 of a mile off the Appalachian Trail. To put this in perspective, it was so inaccessible that a Black Hawk helicopter had to be brought in to airlift her remains out of the area. In the following weeks, investigators worked to piece together what had happened during the time Susan was missing. In April 2019, the Swain County Medical Examiner's Office in North Carolina released the official autopsy report. Susan had died of, quote, complications of hypothermia due to exposure to adverse environmental conditions, with dehydration listed as a contributing factor. The autopsy noted a striking detail. Susan had exhibited signs of paradoxical undressing. She had removed articles of clothing despite the cold, a common late-stage symptom of hypothermia-induced confusion. Apart from scratches and minor abrasions, her body showed no significant injuries and absolutely no evidence of foul play. There were no indications of an attack by animals or other people. Her death was officially ruled accidental. But even with these apparent answers, a haunting question lingered. How did an experienced hiker get so lost in such a short span of time in an area that, earlier in the day, had been filled with visitors? One theory is that it was simply a tragic navigational mistake. Perhaps as Susan continued toward the parking area, she missed a critical intersection. Not far from the Klingman's Dome parking lot, the Forney Ridge Trail meets another path, which leads to the Appalachian Trail and the Dome parking area. It's possible that in the fog, Susan walked right past the trail that led to the parking lot. If she mistakenly continued straight, she would have found herself on the Appalachian Trail, heading away from Klingman's Dome. In the low visibility and rain, she may not have realized the error until she was well beyond the intended turn. If Susan indeed took a wrong turn and unknowingly ventured onto the Appalachian Trail, she may have continued for some time, expecting to find the parking area around each bend. At some point, she likely understood that she was not on the right path. In that panicked state, with night falling, Susan could have attempted to find her own way out. This leads to another aspect of lost hiker behavior that is well known and documented, but isn't fully understood from a psychological standpoint. Often, disoriented hikers will head downhill or toward water in hopes of finding a road or help. The logic is generally believed to be that finding a stream downhill might lead to a path to civilization. Susan's final location suggests she may have done exactly this. Once off the established trail and moving downhill through the trackless forest, she would have been in very perilous terrain. Thick vegetation can look impenetrable at eye level, and steep slopes in the Smokies are slick and strewn with roots and rocks. It's easy to get injured or exhausted in such conditions, a fact which is doubly true with night falling. Another possible theory involves a physical injury or medical emergency. The idea here is that she may have tripped and suffered a minor concussion, which disoriented her. The subsequent investigation didn't report finding significant head trauma. However, a very mild concussion would be both invisible and also potentially enough to make her act out of character, even if only for a brief period. During this brief time, it's speculated that she may have gone off the trail and then become further disoriented, leading to her tragic end. Many have speculated that there may have been an element of foul play involved in driving Susan off the trail. While Susan clearly didn't perish directly to foul play, this theory doesn't claim that, and it actually might even be more terrifying. Rather, the thought is that someone may have simply menaced her off the trail, forcing her to flee into the dense woodland. Once she was off the trail, the perpetrator could have stalked her to force her deeper into the woods, before ultimately leaving her to perish. This theory is speculative, but has gained traction amongst those who have noticed a pattern of disturbing activities in national parks. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to take a moment to share this video with your friends and on your socials. Also, don't forget to check out my other channels, Lazy Chill History and Lazy Chill True Crime. On September 25th, 1981, a disturbing tragedy struck the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees as 58-year-old Polly Melton hiked along the Deep Creek Trail with two close friends. Polly was moving a bit slower than usual that day, prompting some playful teasing from her companions. Polly wasn't about to take the gentle ribbing lightly, and decided to prove to her friends that she still had some athleticism left. She jogged ahead of them on the easy, familiar trail, rounding a bend and disappearing over a small hill. It was all in good fun, or so it seemed at the time. But when Polly's friends crested that same rise just moments later, she was gone. Over a hill and out of sight, Polly Melton had vanished without a trace. Polly's friends thought she must have jogged on back to camp and didn't initially think much of this. After all, they had teased her about how slow she was that day, so perhaps she wanted to get back in record time. It was around 4:30 p.m. when they reached the Deep Creek campground where Polly and her husband were staying. They expected to find Polly relaxing at their campsite after the hike. Instead, they found only Polly's husband, Bob Melton, waiting inside their Airstream trailer, and he hadn't seen Polly at all. Bob, who was 20 years Polly's senior and in frail health, had stayed behind that afternoon. He assumed the women were simply enjoying a longer hike. When Polly's friends arrived without her, worry set in immediately. The group retraced their steps, calling out Polly's name and searching up and down the trail. Other hikers on Deep Creek Trail were asked if they'd seen a tall woman in a pink sleeveless blouse, but no one had. After nearly 2 hours of frantic searching on their own, Polly's friends and husband knew something was very wrong. They contacted park rangers around 6 p.m. and reported Polly Melton missing. Rangers and local authorities sprang into action that evening. Deep Creek Trail, normally a popular easy path near the North Carolina-Tennessee border of the park, was closed to the public as search teams poured in. Over the next week, more than 150 volunteers combed the woods, assisted by park rangers, law enforcement, and search dogs. The searchers scoured miles of trails, thick forest, and the banks of Deep Creek itself, looking for any sign of Polly. Helicopters buzzed overhead, and horse-mounted searchers patrolled remote areas. For 4 days straight, teams methodically covered the area where Polly was last seen and beyond. They found nothing, no scraps of clothing, no footprints leading off trail, no broken branches or disturbed brush. The only clue was fleeting. One of the bloodhounds caught Polly's scent on the trail near the spot where she'd disappeared, beside a downed tree where it seemed she may have paused to rest. But beyond that point, the scent trail evaporated. The canine handlers described the dog circling and whining, confused, as if Polly had simply vanished into thin air. By October 2nd, 1981, after a week of fruitless effort, the official search was scaled back. Though the active search ended, the investigation was just beginning. Family, friends, and authorities were left with a haunting question: what happened to Polly Melton? In trying to solve the mystery, the authorities had to understand who Polly was. Polly Melton was, by all accounts, a friendly, outdoorsy woman enjoying the dawn of her golden years. Born in 1923, Polly had seen a lot of life by her late 50s. She had been widowed twice before finding love again with Bob Melton, an elderly man whom she married in 1975. The couple split their time between Jacksonville, Florida, and the Great Smoky Mountains, where they spent the warmer months living out of their 19-foot Airstream trailer. Polly had no children of her own, so she poured her energy into friendships, her church community, and volunteer work. Every fall at Deep Creek Campground, Polly volunteered daily at a local senior center, helping to serve meals to elderly residents. But everything wasn't sunshine and roses, and as investigators dug into her past more, they turned up some potentially groundbreaking clues. Investigators also learned that Polly had been under some emotional strain earlier that year. She was still grieving her mother's death in 1978, an event that had sent her into a period of deep depression. Friends, however, said Polly seemed to be feeling better lately and that she was back to her cheerful self for the most part. However, the medical records ended up telling a somewhat different story. Interestingly, she had also been prescribed Valium a couple years before, but supposedly stopped taking it by 1981. After Polly vanished, Bob discovered that an entire bottle of his own prescription Valium was missing from their trailer. As the weeks and months passed, several credible theories emerged as to what happened to Polly Melton. One major theory was that Polly left of her own free will, essentially vanishing into a new life. Supporters of this idea pieced together a narrative from those odd clues. Perhaps Polly had been unhappy in her life and quietly planned to run away. Being married to Bob, who at 78 was much older and in poor health, might have left Polly feeling lonely. On the hike, when the opportunity arose, Polly could have hurried ahead of her friends intentionally. Deep Creek Trail isn't very remote. In fact, it eventually leads near a road and parking area by the campground. Some have questioned whether someone could have been waiting there to pick her up. If Polly had a secret companion or lover, they might have used the brief window when she was out of sight to meet her, whisking her away by car. One tantalizing piece of evidence gives some weight to the voluntary getaway theory. In April 1982, about 6 months after Polly vanished, a check made out to Thelma Pauline Melton, her full legal name, was cashed at a bank in Birmingham, Alabama. The check was reportedly an interest payment from one of Polly's investments. It wasn't a huge sum, but it was enough to raise eyebrows. Investigators followed up on this, hoping it meant Polly had resurfaced. Birmingham was roughly 300 miles from where she disappeared, and coincidentally, Polly had been born in Alabama and still had some relatives there. Unfortunately, this clue led nowhere conclusive. The bank couldn't definitively prove who cashed the check. The signature was Polly's name, but whether it was her handwriting or someone forging it was uncertain. No additional money was withdrawn from Polly's accounts, and no sightings of her were confirmed in Alabama or anywhere else. Naturally, some have speculated that this had actually been one of Polly's family members, forging her signature and cashing the check. Another factor I should mention here is the fact that no crime had been committed, so it's almost certain a forensic accountant wasn't retained to fully go through her finances. So it's always possible something was missed, which perhaps proved further financial activity by Polly after she vanished. Another theory considers foul play, though it's a perplexing scenario given the circumstances. If Polly was attacked or abducted on the trail, it would have had to happen in an extremely short window of time and space. It would have basically had to happen in the moments after she went around the bend and before her friends caught up. Park investigators noted there were no footprints or drag marks indicating someone left the trail, and no suspicious strangers were reported in the area. That said, she was believed to have been wearing expensive jewelry at the time of her disappearance. To give just one example, she was wearing a diamond-studded gold watch, an item that could have attracted attention for someone who committed a crime of opportunity. There's also the very real potential that she used Bob's bottle of Valium to ensure September 25th was her final day on Earth. She had experienced significant depression after her mother's death. Further, her husband was in increasingly poor health, and reports indicate that Bob actually had to be moved to a nursing home after Polly went missing. It's possible that the weight of it all just finally broke her, and she went deep into the woods, emptied the bottle, and was never found. Whatever the scenario, her case remains yet another instance of an individual seemingly swallowed up by the Great Smokies.